Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Shine Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Shine Hills at shinehills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
We are across the street and around the world. Shine Hills.
Hello, Cheyenne Hills. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Julie Fogg, and I'm here this morning with Nathan Winters. Nathan, thanks
It's good to see you, Julie. It's been too long.
It has been a long time since I've hung out with you in a podcast.
I was going to say, Galen, you sure have changed your appearance.
Well, I know. Yeah. Galen, he decided to grow his hair out. You know, he's summer, and, why not?
His voice kind of pitched upwards a little bit.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, it works out for him. I just thought this would be a great time. Galen actually has been doing a really cool thing. We're recording this during Frontier Week.
Yeah.
And he has been going out every day as a chaplain for the contestants for the rodeo, spending some time in prayer with them and doing a devotional. And so that's been
Wonderful.
a great thing for him, and a great outreach for him and for our church, and certainly for those contestants as well.
Yeah.
So I'm in his chair today and get to spend some time with you. So
no, that
thanks
works
for being
well. I'm
here.
excited for that because to impact these people, to impact their lives as they come into town. That's exactly what we would hope for across the street and around the world.
Absolutely.
That's great.
And I don't know if you were able to catch it, but he was able to do an interview with one of the bullfighters, and his name is Dusty Tuckness. And that was a part of the weekend services, the first weekend of Frontier Days. And so it was really neat to hear about his faith and just how he talked about how he stands in the gap for these cowboys, and just like Christ stood in the gap for us. And so it was a really neat analogy. And so it's been getting some plays around the social media world. So it's been cool that he's been able to make those. So you've been doing some amazing things as well. Maybe you can catch us up a little bit.
Well,
about what's going on.
absolutely. So I was out of town all of last week, and in Washington, D.C. at the Family Policy Foundation's Statesman Academy.
Oh, wow.
Which is wonderful. We had leaders from around the country get together, but also it was wonderful on Capitol Hill on Wednesday evening. We had Minority Floor Leader Kevin McCarthy from the House, and Representative Jim Banks from Indiana, who is the head of the Republican Study Committee, and about 12 to 14 other congressmen. Actually, I lost track because there were so many that came.
Oh, wow.
And it was just wonderful to hear them talk about how their faith touches public policy, which is so important in a culture in which people try to get away from the idea that a person of faith should be involved in anything. It was wonderful to point out how their faith actually builds them up as moral people and makes them better equipped to work in public policy. And so for them to share that to elected leaders from across the country was just wonderful at the Statesman Academy.
That's really cool. And you got to speak at it. I mean, tell us a little about what you spoke about.
That was astonishing. So on Wednesday morning, we had Congressman Molinar from Michigan speak and did a great job.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then I spoke on Thursday morning, and then Oz Guinness, a hero of mine, spoke on Friday morning. And I thought, this is extremely rarefied air for me, but God really blessed it. Yeah. And it was just truly an honor to be there among all those other people.
Yeah, maybe you can share a little bit about what you spoke about, then tell us a little bit about Oz Guinness and your time with him as well.
Absolutely. You know, it was so amazing. So I picked this up. One of the events that we had was held at the Museum of the Bible, which, oh, by the way, if you ever get to DC, you've got to go.
Yeah.
It's $500 million. So the Green family who started Hobby Lobby.
Yes. Okay.
They're people of tremendous faith, and they have put a lot of money into putting the Museum of the Bible together. And there they had a special exhibit on the Magna Carta. They, of course, have tons of artifacts from Israel. And you can see how the Old Testament was formed. And then they have a lot of manuscripts from the New Testament. And it's just, it's glorious. It's 6 stories tall. It takes up an entire block. Wow. And it's amazing. But while I was there in their bookstore, they had this mug, which it says, "Be strong and courageous," which is how we always close our program.
That's great.
And I thought, well, and not only that, that really was the topic of our Statesman Academy.
Really?
Because when we talk about standing strong together, which was the theme, it really takes all of us standing together, standing strong. And that was sort of the topic of my conversation and my talk on Thursday morning. What I was talking about, the Bible tells us God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And then I walked back through in the book of Exodus, a situation where that really played out in the lives of the children of Israel. And so God really used that. I used several illustrations from my own life and watching my children. And I'll tell you in brief, I know we've got a number of things, but one time I walked downstairs. This is when we still lived in Thermopolis, and I heard a kid whispering. And as a dad, I've just found that when you find kids whispering, you need to go investigate, you know.
It's usually not a good thing.
Right. Well, I found my youngest, and he was probably about 5 or 6 maybe at the time. And the lights were out in our laundry room, which is a basement room anyway, so it was already sort of dark, but I could still see him. And he had a cowboy hat on that the brim had gone kind of flat, and he had an eye patch on one eye, and he had a red sash draped around him, and he had his PJ pants tucked into his socks. I don't know what that means. And he had kind of a collapsible lightsaber.
Okay.
And it was out, and he was waving it, and he was talking. And I looked around. There was no one else in the room. And I heard him say something like, well, you better come out here or I'm going to get you. And so I just stood and watched. You know, when you have a scene like that, you don't want to break the scene.
Right.
And so I just kept looking at him. And finally, though, he kind of jumped because I think he sensed someone else was in the room. And when he turned around, he let out the highest pitched scream I've ever heard in my life. It was, by the way, as a dad, that's a glorious moment.
Yeah.
But when he did, though, it turned into a giggle real quickly. And I said, son, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm in here catching dragons.
Oh.
And I said, oh, really? And it dawned on me in that moment that in his mind, he really was in a cave with a dragon, and he had a sword, but not much else. And when he sensed another presence in this fictional cave in his mind, it was real. And the dragon had gotten him. And what I brought out of that was the fact that many times we're engaged in battles that are in the mind, and they may not be necessarily real, but they are definitely battles in the mind. And when we look at that, the way that we interact with our culture today, a lot of times we forget the fact that Peter wrote, God has not given us a spirit of fear. And yet many Christians react in fear. So what is causing that? And that is a battle that's in the mind that's playing out in their actions. God instead has given us a spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And that was the topic of that. I went through several elements from the book of Exodus. But,
awesome. Well, that's really important because how often do we find ourselves in fear of speaking truth or even just standing for what we believe in and feeling like we have to pull back because of whatever a consequence may be. And so we end up staying silent or not reacting or not doing anything. And so it does make it really easy to just stay captive in those thoughts in your head. And so, that's powerful.
One of the things to bring out of that is that I think God does push us up against difficult and impossible situations to help us to grow in our faith. And this is what I was drawing out of Exodus. Pharaoh, after the 10 plagues, the 10th would being so horrific that the oldest boy in every throughout the land, the oldest person, it was just, they died. And so finally, the nation of Egypt were literally giving gold and silver, please, just we'll pay you to leave. And Pharaoh turned around shortly afterward and turned to the commanders of his army and said, listen, they're going to get entangled in the land. And the point I wanted to bring is the world expects us to be entangled in the world. And so the children of Israel, though, they broke through all of those entanglements, but now they found themselves up confronted with a Red Sea with nowhere to go. And it was then that they looked up to the horizon and saw the dust clouds coming of Pharaoh's armies. And when you think about that moment, there was tremendous terror. They even said, Moses, you've brought us out here to die.
Right.
They had just watched God do amazing things in Israel. And now, in a complete lack of faith, they responded instead in terror. And it was then, though, that God brought the triumph. And so I think God sometimes allows us to get into these impossible situations so that we can truly see him for who he is. And that should be true for us today.
Absolutely. And how easy is it when I'm working out of my own strength, then I don't really need God. And I mean, boy, I found myself in those kind of situations all the time. Like, well, I and that's where I think even finding areas of ministry, I talk with people that are looking to serve all the time. Sometimes that serving in an area that is not necessarily in your strength it's so much easier to give God the glory and for him to be able to fill you, to pour out. And it's so important to rely on his strength and not on our own.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's important to remember. And so when we talk about being strong and very courageous, what you just brought out, and I appreciate very much, is you can't be truly strong and courageous in your own flesh. It is something that comes from a relationship with someone who is greater and stronger than all. And this is something that oftentimes we forget. And it's an important doctrine of the faith, and it's called the omnipotence of our God. God is all powerful, which is what that word means. But he is all powerful. And so in our own flesh, there is no power. The Satan is the prince and power of the air. He is a terrible foe. And he absolutely can slay us, except that we have a God who is greater within us than he that's in the world. And so it's all about God. And so God is the one that gives the victory. God is the one that makes us strong and very courageous.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it just takes one of those little types of situations where you realize that, I am really completely powerless. I have zero control or very little control over, certainly circumstances but what I do have control is of who I choose to draw my strength from. And if I'm trying it from me, I'm never going to fulfill that. If I can draw it from God, then he's faithful every time. So, the series that you're currently going through, Broken Together, really comes to that. God allows us to all have some sort of brokenness. Now that brokenness looks different in different lives. Galen and I, last conversation that we had, we're talking about different ways in which our lives had been broken. But the same thing is true for us today, that God allows us to walk into those difficult circumstances where there is no answer other than himself, so that we can see our own brokenness, but how he, as the master potter, is the one that puts us back together and makes us useful for his kingdom. That is the highest goal for a Christian. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Nathan, tell us a little bit about what's coming up next in your world.
Oh, yes. Well, I'll be traveling out to Virginia to speak to the Family Foundation in Virginia. And it's just that is a well-established group that's very similar to what we are starting here in Wyoming, but it's much, much larger and has been around much longer.
Okay.
But to go and speak to those people and encourage them, but also people that work alongside them, so from across Virginia. And the amazing thing is, I'll be standing in the place where many of our fathers in the faith fought for religious freedom. It'll be within about an hour of where a couple of men, Isaac Backus, John Leland, great pastors from that era, actually, because they had felt persecution themselves. One of them had actually been whipped for preaching. He was a Baptist minister and was in a Congregationalist state, and they whipped him in the town square.
Wow.
And so you think about that. But those two men heavily influenced both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And so what we're talking about today, religious freedom, I'm going to be right there where those guys were. And those kind of historical facts are never lost on me and shouldn't be on anyone.
Right.
Because it's what we stand for today.
Right. It's the backbone really of our country and our government. And just
Right.
as that started. So very cool. And you said you're going to be doing some sightseeing as well.
Well, they set aside just a little bit of time to just travel in that rough area. We're going to be fairly close to where Monticello is.
Oh, yes.
And there's just, when you go to Virginia, there's history everywhere.
Oh.
And so
yeah, you can't hardly take a step without
Yeah.
seeing anything.
I did ask, I said, how close are we to do with anything with James Madison? It's hard to choose a favorite founding father, but James Madison is in my, I don't know where to place him. He's either at number one or he's definitely in my top three.
Yes,
you know?
okay.
But Madison, he was in Virginia. I don't know how close we are.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's going to be a tremendous opportunity. But more than anything, just to minister and then watch how that organization, how God has allowed it to develop through the years. And frankly, I have a ton of questions myself.
Yeah.
Just to see how they do things.
That'll be really cool. Well, I have a question that might put you on the spot a little
Sure.
bit, but I was listening to a podcast about Thomas Jefferson, and they mentioned a little bit about his faith and how he would piecemeal the Bible together in order to make it work for him. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts are about Thomas Jefferson's faith, and was he a believer? Was he more on the agnostic side of things, or
Right.
what's your thought?
I don't believe he was an agnostic. This is intriguing because history is a long-term debate. So we look at data, and then different people will try to draw different things out of it.
Sure.
Which in our current climate, intellectual climate, there are many people that want to paint him as an agnostic or an atheist, actually. He wasn't that. First of all, let's approach the subject of the Bible. He did cut portions out of a Bible, and but those portions, some people have said he just tried to cut out all of the miracles. That isn't necessarily true. Not in the actual Bible that he did this for. What he was contending was that if you look at a moral ethic, they were talking about different folks like Lao Tzu and Confucius, and you look through many of the things that come out of India. He was pointing out that as a moral ethic alone, the Bible stands head and shoulders above all else, apart from what it tells us about God, but that it is, even just as a moral ethic, it ranks supreme. And so that's what he was attempting to do to prove that out. There's a great book on that subject called The Jefferson Lies, where it points that many people say, so let me just come back one more time and point out something else. Thomas Jefferson was a deist, as was Ben Franklin. A deist in that day meant something different than a deist today.
Okay.
They were certain that, one, there was a deity, and they were fairly certain that that deity came through the Judeo-Christian history. So they felt very certain about Jehovah God of the Old Testament and Jesus Christ of the New. They certainly were not assured of which specific denomination was right. So they're looking at it, if you look at it just 250 years off of the Reformation, they weren't sure about all the claims between the various denominations in the struggles that had occurred prior to them. So they knew they believed in God, but they didn't know which church they would go to.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so that really is something to remember about Thomas Jefferson. The other thing too is, because of his faith, Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, and that's immoral, he also recognized that immorality and struggled all of his life to try to figure out how to set his slaves free. And so I think that that's something also there was a conversation going on where they were trying to figure out how can we make all men free, knowing that all men are created equal. How can we make that happen, knowing that if we set them free, other people might snatch them right up, which was built into the Virginia law at that time. So that was a dangerous thing. And secondly, there was no way to actually pay for their manumission. That was one of the other elements. And so these figures from history are complex. Every person that you know has a complex history. And so I don't think anyone that would be listening to this show would want to be summarized by one specific act they did at one time in their life.
Absolutely.
We all have complexity, and Thomas Jefferson is one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thanks for
Yeah.
kind of talking about that a little bit. I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. So I appreciate you unpacking that. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us and giving us a little bit of updates, and look forward to hearing from you when you get back from Virginia. And I'm sure Pastor Galen will be back with you in studio.
Well, I've enjoyed seeing you again.
So
It's just been great. I appreciate
Yeah.
what you do for this church and what this church does for Wyoming.
Well, thank you very much. So, well, in the meantime, Cheyenne Hills, thanks for hanging with us, and be strong and very courageous.